So yeah, thank you so much for being here. My name is Avik Bhattacharya. I am director of the Social Market Foundation. 3 days, wherever we are, Inter-Party Conference to hold an event on healthy eating. I'm afraid that is where we've managed to arrange ourselves. So if that's not too masochistic, this is as good an opportunity as any. Life expectancy is flatlining, and in many cases, in many demographics, going backwards, and that obesity is a huge contributor to that. That is a moral failing and a societal failing for certain. That is a tragedy in itself, but obviously has broader economic and social implications beyond that. So I'm not going to labor the point. Hopefully everybody is here because you believe that obesity is a problem that we need to get to grips with. But I'm really keen here to try and look at what some of the solutions might be. What is it that we can do to address the major health challenges that we face in the years ahead, and in particularly to talk about the role of prevention approaches. Almost everybody will say that insofar as we can, we want to go upstream and address problems before they happen. But what does that look like in practice, and how can we do that? And also to look at the question of how government can work with industry, because there are many players in the food ecosystem, and we are not going to solve this problem without altering the way that manufacturers and retailers behave. So how can we do that in a constructive way that ideally kind of protects the consumer choice that we have and the pleasure that we can get from food, while also addressing the great health challenges that we have. So thanks very much for joining us. Welcome to the people of the internet. Those of you who are streaming online, please pop questions and comments in the box as we go. In terms of format, we're going to go to the panelists, give them 2 minutes each, which is incredibly tight. But I'll be forgiving if you go. I'll maybe give you 3 if you're lucky. We'll have a discussion just among us on the panel, and then throw open to the audience for Q&A. And that, as I say, includes those of you following at home or in the office or online, wherever you are. But to start and to kick us off, I am going to give the first opportunity to contribute to Hugo Harper, who is Director of the Healthy Life Mission at Nesta, in particular to talk through some of the ideas that they've been working on and preview a proposal that they have that they think might help crack this wicked challenge.
Thanks very much. Everyone hear me okay? Right distance of microphone? Excellent. Yeah, so my name's Hugo Harper. I'm from Nesta. We're an innovation charity, and I run the Healthy Life mission. And as why are we here? We want to improve the number of healthy life years lived. We want people to live a long and happy life. That's why we're here. And one of the major contributors to ill health in the country at the moment is what people eat. And then that's sort of measured often by obesity. So our mission goal is to halve obesity, but we're doing that because we want to increase the number of healthy life years. We want people to have a better life. And so how do we go about doing that? Well, all of the evidence suggests that the most effective ways to do this is to change the food environment. So this is make it easy to eat healthily, essentially. At the moment, odds are stacked against people. We tell them that they should eat healthily. We implore them. We say, you know, if only you had the goodwill to do it, why aren't you sensible enough to try it whilst having an environment that makes it incredibly difficult to do so? And so that's the sort of thing we're trying to change. We're trying to make it easier for people to eat more healthy. And how do you do that? Well, in practice, that can look like changing what's advertised to people. That can look at changing what's promoted, either in sort of one-off price promotions or general day-to-day costings of things. It can look at the ease of access that people have to it. So when we talk about the food environment, we mean that in a broad sense. So holistically, what your friends do, what your family does, not just the physical environment that people are in. And so if we want to change that for the better, well, we get most of our food from retailers. Most of the food in the UK is consumed in the home, about 70% of it. And so that's where most people get most of their food. And so that makes sense as a place to target. And so what we're proposing today, and we'll go into a bit more detail on this, is can you set up some mandatory targets that are backed by financial penalties to sort of move retailers towards healthier sales? So this proposal is looking at mandatory targets across what is sold at retailers. And it's looking at, I'll go into more detail on this later, but the nutrient profiling model. So how healthy food is. And so then the idea here is you take an outcomes-based approach. You say, retailers, you know what's best in terms of how to sell food. And so you can have all of the levers that you want to do that. We just need to make sure that the health of the nation's being prioritized. So if you hit this target, no issues, everybody's happy. Whereas if you don't, there are financial penalties that kind of match the negative externalities that the country currently has to bear for the costs of this ill health. So that's what we're talking about today for the most part, but it's all at the core of it, making it easy for people to live a healthy life.
Thanks, Hugo. A lot of material crammed there into a couple of minutes. So next, I would like to turn to Karen Betts, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Food and Drinks Federation and therefore represents our food producers. So Karen, how can industry and government work best together in order to tackle this challenge?
Well, thank you very much. So the Food and Drink Federation, which is the organisation that I run, represents food manufacturers in the UK. So it's generally the bit of the food system you don't see so obviously. So everybody sees farmers at one end and shops at the other, and food manufacturing is what happens in the middle. So we buy ingredients from farmers and we sell products to retailers, and that you will buy in supermarkets and other shops on a regular basis. And our member companies' aim really is to sell delicious food that we want to eat, food that brings us pleasure and joy, for that food to be nutritious. And there's lots of information on product packs now about what's in the food and what its nutritional value is. We produce safe food and drink. That's really important to us as well. Our industry in the UK more broadly has a really, really good reputation on producing safe food that's good for consumers. And we want that food to be available. We have a huge range of choice in the UK across really all sorts of different products. So choice is really important to us too. And then affordability is part of that. So a range of choice at a range of different price points. And the companies that are member companies of the Food and Drink Federation, generally all cupboards will be made up of sort of 70% of the products that we produce, and probably similarly in your fridges as well. And it is really important to us, and it's why I'm grateful to be involved in the discussion, that our food is a source of health and not a source of ill health. And we are absolutely part of those conversations with government and with other bodies about how we try to make sure that people are able to lead healthy and balanced diets and lifestyles, so that people are able to have a range of different foods in what they're eating across a day and across a week. And that generally, one of the things that our industry is doing more and more of, but I mean has been working on for more than 10 years, is how we change recipes, particularly of much loved brands, to make them, to take out some of the fat, salt and sugar, and to add fibre, fruit and vegetables, because that's generally what we should all be doing more of, eating less of salt, fat and sugar, and more fibre, fruit and veg. So yes, there's a massive reformulation program that goes on across companies in the industry, and I should say that as part of that, 13% fewer calories are now present in an average shopping basket, 15% less sugar, and 24% less salt. So there's been a massive change in some of the products that you and I would buy on a daily basis. And I should say I'm very happy to talk about that in more detail as the panel goes on. But the point I think I would really like to emphasise on that is changing the recipes of products isn't easy. You all probably cook in your kitchens, and you've all substituted ingredients in a recipe when you haven't had something, or you've wanted to change a recipe. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And so we have scientists and innovators who work in labs and kitchens right across the industry trying to change products to make them healthier for people. But it's massive investment, and it involves decades worth of research and R&D, and I think that's really important to remember. Also, our companies work on portion size. So how can we help consumers to eat the foods that they enjoy, but perhaps to eat less of them. And we also have a program called Action on Fibre, where we are encouraging more and more of our companies, and and many of them are doing this now, to add fibre to common products. And we also fortify a lot of products, and you will see that from breads to breakfast cereal to flour to that sort of thing, to make sure that nutrients and minerals are available in those products where they are commonly consumed. So it is something that we really, really care about. We are also looking at workplace health at the moment. I can talk about that in a bit more detail. So how as employers, we work with our workforces to try to encourage healthy eating and healthy habits. And that's something that we are talking to the government about in more detail. We are engaged in programmes on community health, and we are thinking as broadly as we can at the moment on where we might bring some of our company expertise to government conversations about public health programmes. What resonates with consumers, what doesn't. So that's a broad sort of sweep across who we are as an industry, how much we care about this topic, and what we're doing.
Brilliant. Thanks, Karen. And next, I'd like to bring in Richard Sloggett, who is a former advisor to the Health Secretary and currently director and founder of Future Health, which is a public policy research centre.
Thank you very much. So I think there's a problem with the question. And the problem with the question is prevention versus treatment. And that is not the right question. Because if this was cancer, we wouldn't say we either do one or the other. So why are we doing it in obesity policy? And now we have new treatments coming through. I think we need to look at this issue slightly differently. And I think what it does when we say prevention versus treatment is it plays into the frame and the dynamics of, well, this is about individual willpower and too much about personal responsibility. And then we go nanny state, and we have all those debates. And basically, there's a fundamental design flaw in the way obesity policy has been conducted for the last 30 years, which is why we've had nearly 700 policies, but the obesity rate has continued to go up and up and up. And what we need to figure out is how we can build a better design framework for how we do obesity policy. If you look at smoking, the learning I think that people have taken from smoking is that the smoking ban was the best thing that ever happened to drive down smoking rates. The smoking ban was brilliant, but it wasn't the only thing that's been done on smoking. It was about studies, research, information, tax, legislation, regulation. There's a whole plethora of things that were done that got the smoking rate down from 45% in 1974 to about 12, 13% now. It's a huge public health success story. The obesity rate has gone in completely the other direction if you look at the graph. So we need to be much more assertive from a public policy perspective in how we tackle obesity, and we need an obesity strategic plan or framework that covers all of those different elements, from prevention, public health, all the way through to treatment and NHS design of services. In certain parts of the country, you cannot access NHS obesity services, weight management services. There's a complete postcode lottery. So what we need to do is, rather than pitch for a specific policy, put it in the headlines, and then have that policy whittled down, diluted, delayed, and then not happen. And even if it does happen, it makes an impact. Siddle is a classic example. It's good, but it's not enough on its own. We need to build a really robust obesity strategy that covers the whole pathway and framework and takes us from public health through to NHS and through to treatment. And the learning from the last 30 years is that we haven't necessarily done that. Now, I think the proposal that's been put on the table at the very start from Hugo is a really interesting one that we should be debating. But what we shouldn't assume is that one thing is going to be sufficient. We have 60% of people in this country who are overweight or obese. This is a significant problem that won't be solved through one lever. We need to be thinking about this much more radically. And I wouldn't frame it as a prevention versus treatment discussion, because I think that's part of the problem that we have in trying to make progress on this issue. Thank you.
Brilliant. Great. Thanks very much. And next, I'm going to turn to Sophie Lawrence, who is Greenbank Stewardship and Engagement Lead, and who helped set up the Investor Coalition on Food Policy, which tries to harness the power of the investment community to engage with government on food-related issues.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I kind of bring some combined hats to this discussion. I guess one, in my role, I'm thinking about how shareholder power can kind of contribute to sort of, changing some of the systemic challenges that we face, and we work across a number of different environmental, social issues. But also, as Avik mentioned, I set up the Investor Coalition on Food Policy in response to the National Food Strategy. And I wanted to give you a little bit of context in my opening remarks about kind of where that came about. So as investors, we are looking to kind of drive long-term value creation for our clients and beneficiaries. And increasingly, investors are seeing the material financial risks that inaction on improving the health of our nation and also kind of more globally, although the challenge looks different depending on which jurisdiction you're looking at. Alongside, I know health is our focus today, but a whole range of other food system risks, such as nature-related risks and climate change and antimicrobial resistance, which we can park for this discussion. And really, it's really important for us as part of understanding those risks to be able to see what kind of things companies are doing to ready themselves to respond to those risks. And we think about those both as direct risks. So we're looking at how the regulatory landscape is changing and what impact that will have on companies. We're looking at the kind of reputation risk angle, but also this systemic risk, which we'll probably hear a lot about in terms of how, if we don't tackle this issue, how that's impacting every company and every industry, not just the food sector. And that's why round our coalitions, we now have over 30 investors and over 6 trillion in assets under management represented. We have a lot of institutional investors who are investors in the whole economy, and they really see this systemic risk angle. So what have we been doing? In response to National Food Strategy, we've been engaging with government, cross-party, but particularly with the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and the Department for Health. We might get back to this challenge, but I think one of the challenges that we've definitely already seen is how we need to be thinking about this issue across government, because different departments all play an important role. And we were really excited to see the Food Data Transparency Partnership committed to last year, although we've been disappointed to actually see the kind of slight rollback in ambition on that. And the last thing I just want to mention in my opening remarks, and why the Food Data Transparency Partnership is really interesting, is I mentioned we need to be able to understand those risks. And right now, if we look at something like health, we're having to compare companies in our portfolios, and we don't really have good data to be able to do that. So one company might be using one nutrient profiling model, they might be using their own nutrient profiling model, which when we're then trying to compare across retailers or across manufacturers, out of home sector, becomes really challenging. What does good look like? And what consistent metrics can we all be using to actually sort of show that? So that's why we're really supportive of mandatory reporting. And voluntary reporting has been out there for a really long time. There's multiple different frameworks that companies can use, but the companies that we speak to say they really want that level playing field. They want to be able to know which one to tie their mask to. It takes a lot to develop that data. So having consistent agreed methodologies for collecting key data on health is really important. So that's a little bit about us, and want to get into more of those issues in more detail as we progress this discussion.
Brilliant, thank you. And last, I'm going to turn to Joe Gideon, MP for Stoke Central and Vice Chair of the All-Party Group on Obesity.
Thank you, and I was also the Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the National Food Strategy, which is particularly relevant, I think, here. So the benefit of coming last is that pretty much everything's been covered, but I'm going to try and say something original, which is that we can't deliver prevention without people buying into it. I know that sounds simple, but it's the most important statement to make. And in order for everybody to be able to buy into it, the solutions to a healthy diet have to be affordable. And I would slightly disagree with Karen on the importance of choice, because I think choice is something that you have if you can afford choices. We should have healthy options that are affordable to everybody. I think COVID taught us one thing, that the susceptibility to illness and to becoming very ill was increased not just by levels of obesity, but also levels of social deprivation. And I think that we have to think holistically about food as part of, I hate to use the levelling up term, but it sits very much within how does everybody have fair access to foods that won't make them ill. So I would venture to suggest that we maybe need less choice rather than more choice, but we need choices that enable us to make healthy lifestyle choices, not based on our financial ability to pay, but based on our decision that that's the right thing to do. I was speaking to somebody, I don't want to advertise, but somebody from Holland and Barrett earlier today, and they said when they started looking at the products on their shelves from a kind of health perspective, they removed about 400 ranges that they realised actually were not healthy, or not doing what they thought would be good. And I think that the understanding of what's good to eat is also quite challenging, because to prevent obesity, you have to know what the right things are to eat. So the level of kind of the public health role is a vitally important one. And going back to COVID again, I think that for the first time in a very long time, maybe Britain, it was maybe first time since the war, Britain listened to the government. We were very compliant. There was no real pushback on when we were told to wear masks and socially distance and wash our hands and everything. So for the first time for a very long time, public health became something that everybody did, everybody listened to, and didn't question. And I think we should actually build on that as well. This is a really important role, whether it's smoking cessation or better diet, and think that this isn't nanny statism. This is actually a responsible government looking to improve the health of the nation. And clearly that has impact on productivity, on cost of the NHS. I mean, if we want to parcel it up in it's good for the economy, we can do it that way. If we want to say everybody wants their children to be healthy, and therefore it's about making sure the next generation doesn't struggle with the same problems. But ultimately, there has to be a clear voice that helps individual behaviour change by making it a cultural behaviour change and making it easy.
Fantastic. So thanks everyone. Incredibly succinct, which is always appreciated when you're chairing an event like this, and we've got this many panelists to wrangle, but lots and lots of food for thought there, if you'll pardon the pun. So one of the things that kind of leapt out at me from those initial contributions was, obviously Karen's been talking about all the positive steps that industry has taken. Hugo there was talking about harnessing industry, but kind of with the force of the state behind it, basically levying penalties if they don't go far enough or they don't achieve what we want to achieve. There are some people out there who would be hardline and would say, well, industry is part of the problem. That's why we've ended up in this mess, because they've created a food environment where it's so easy for people to be obese. So this is quite a broad question, quite a conceptual question. What's the appropriate role of industry in tackling the obesity challenge? And what is the relationship that it should stand into relative to the state? I'll start with Richard and I'll work my way down, if that's okay.
I think this is a great question to ask, because I think you can work collaboratively with an industry, whether it's the food industry or whether it's the NHS or the pharmaceutical industry or whatever industry it is, without necessarily agreeing on everything. That's about having a grown-up relationship in government with particular industries, and the food and drink industry employs a lot of people, contributes a lot to the economy regionally, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you take what, again, it's not a versus, it's not we're just going to do voluntary or we're going to do sort of regulation. You have to do a bit of everything and a bit of both, and it has to probably make both sides feel uncomfortable to be working. And if it's not, which it probably isn't at the moment, because both sides probably feel like there's, I don't know, from the government side, there's a lack of energy to do much on this. And from the food and drink industry side, there's probably a feeling of, well, we've kind of got to keep going as we are for a long, long time, and we can probably keep going. So I think you need a bit of grit in the oyster of that relationship to kind of actually probably deliver the change. I don't think you need to, again, pick one or the other. I think you need a grown-up sort of type of relationship. And part of the challenge that's been raised by other panelists is a really good one on the cross-government working side, because what you find on this is that the levers and agendas in government don't necessarily align. And then what you get is you get departments that are actively working against one another. So it might be, in this case, the business department is working against the health department, for example. And what you really need there is you need senior government leadership around a set of core objectives and agendas and budgets, which basically bangs heads together to make it happen and to make it work. And I don't think on obesity we've had that, which is part of the sort of design floor piece. So I think there's something on the relationship, can't just be sort of both sides sort of, you know, getting on really, really well or not getting on. And there's something about cross-government working, which is, I think, really, really intrinsic to this, but that needs to be set at the very top of government.
Yes, so we talk about obesity, but I think also within the healthy nation debate, we also mention malnutrition, because, you know, there is a lot of public health issues around that, and so what we eat and how nutritious it is really important. I wouldn't want to demonize the food and drink industry, because I think there are a lot of very good examples of people doing the right thing and working towards making better, healthier products. What they want is a level playing field, and retailers as well, because you know, it's sometimes easier to produce a cheaper, sugary alternative that then will appear more attractive, and you know, especially if it's cheaper. So I think, you know, the sugar tax was successful. I'd be quite happy as probably an outlier Conservative MP to see something along the lines of that for HFSS foods and looking at ultra processed foods to see if we can make the same rules for everybody. I know that that's kind of going quite far down the line, and that may be an aspiration that you know, it's a carrot and stick bit. It's kind of, well, if you don't work with us and try to make these reformulations really work, then we're going to go, you know, on the stick side.
So I think, yeah, importantly, food's not tobacco, right? That argument kind of gets brought up, and we need food. And so there's lots of good parts about food. There's a lot of joy there, but you still need to, I think when we're involving industry, they probably shouldn't be involved in setting the level of ambition. You know, that's a sort of a health challenge that, you know, they don't face some of the negative sides of that, maybe some of the workforce stuff, but they shouldn't be involved in setting the ambition, but they should absolutely be involved in how to achieve it. And that's why we're trying to sort of retain maximum flexibility in proposals, because the chances of, you know, people like me getting it completely right when they've never run a supermarket is unlikely, right? It's unlikely that I'll hit on the exact right idea. We want to be setting targets or outcomes based for them to achieve, and then working with industry in close partnership to work out what are the genuine limitations that they face. You know, we want them to take salt out of products, but that will affect the shelf life, and then that might affect the costs. You know, that there are meaningful considerations here. So yeah, I draw that distinction. Don't set the level of ambition, but do involve them in how to achieve it.
And Karen, really interested to know what responsibilities you want to take on and what you think the appropriate relationship with government is.
So I think that the food industry has to be involved in this conversation. You know, at the end of the day, we feed a population of 70 million people in the UK. And if it wasn't for the products that our companies made and many more that are not represented by the Food and Drink Federation, we would all be going hungry, and the question would be quite different. And you know, and that does go to the, you know, part of the problem, I think, is that after the war, both farming and food manufacture became much more efficient. And we are now able to produce greater quantities of food much more efficiently. And that, to a degree, has led us to the problem of plenty rather than not enough. And at the same time, as food and drink has become more plentiful and more affordable, we have all started to lead much more sedentary lifestyles. I mean, there were professions, or many, much of the population was involved in physical work post-war, and there was a view for a while that exercise, you shouldn't exercise because it might be bad for your health, because many people had physical ailments from manual labour. So, society and the food industry has moved on. Absolutely, the food industry needs to be part of the conversation. What I would say to some of the points made earlier, I think, is that, and particularly to Richard's point, I think we would really agree that there is no one solution. It will have to be, if we are to make an impact on this issue that is a real challenge to all of us, there is no one solution. It will need to be a variety of different things and a variety of different interventions, because it is a really complex problem. There are some things that industry can do, some things we're already working on, some things we would be very happy to talk to government about doing in the future. There is maybe some more regulation that will help, and we can talk about the incentives and disincentives there, because sometimes there are second order consequences that are not necessarily considered at the time. So we definitely should be involved in that conversation. There is something about education and helping people understand what a balanced diet is, and what that is across a day, what that is across a week. I have a personal view that that the nutritional information on packaging can be quite confusing. I know something about food and I find it quite confusing. So I do wonder whether we are helping people sometimes make the healthiest choice, and the healthiest choice within their budget. And to your point, Joe, I think there is actually quite a lot of choice at the more affordable end of the spectrum. But yeah, we need to help people understand what the labelling means and what direction that might point them in. There are all sorts of other factors that come into it. Poverty and deprivation is a big part of it. Housing comes into that as well. So I absolutely agree with the point that there should be better cross-Whitehall join up on this. Very often you have one department chasing one particular goal without that being linked to a goal that another department is chasing. So I am all for the collaboration, and our industry is very open to the conversation. As I said earlier, a huge amount of investment has gone into our ability to change products to make them more healthy over time. So we are absolutely invested in that.
Yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, I think just to build, I just want to build slightly on Joe's point around the level playing field. That is so important from an investor perspective. And when we're talking about these really complex issues, they're so difficult for companies to tackle in isolation. And so we need to create that level playing field through well-designed regulation. But I think the other thing that I really wanted to stress as well was the certainty in policy, and how important that is, because as companies and as investors, we're not just making changes on a year, sort of 2-year cycle. We are having to respond, but thinking about how do I invest for 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead. And I think we need to get better at thinking about the importance of that. So the policy signals are important, but it's about their consistency and whether they're continuous, which is going to actually drive the right innovation from companies to respond. And that's where I kind of wanted to go next, which is, industry can be, there's such an innovative, there's so much innovation there. And actually there's this real ability to respond to changing needs if you do have those consistent long-term policy signals. And I just wanted to call out, I think there's a huge part of role to play with reformulation and the sort of more established brands making their products healthier. But there's also the kind of challenger brands that are starting to kind of take a foothold. And Guy's and St Thomas's Impact for Urban Health is a really interesting case study here. They have a sort of impact investment fund focused on challenger brands, and actually they've been growing really well. They've been doing really well at getting their products into retailers. They've been getting good early investment, and some of those products are trying to kind of reshape, 80% less sugar chocolate spread. So it's still chocolate spread, but it's a lot healthier. And I think that's a really exciting role that industry can play as well. But I just wanted to stress those long-term policy signals are so important from an investment and company perspective.
Thanks, Sophie. So I'd like to pick up on Jo's comment in her initial point, in her initial contribution, which is talking about getting buy-in, and use that as a chance to maybe talk about some of the political constraints. So obviously, we have not made substantial progress on obesity, and we're certainly far worse than we were 30 years ago. And to some extent, that seems like a clear political failure. But what are the political constraints? Because often the polling is not is not particularly negative. Is this about public attitudes? Is this about ideology? Is this about kind of keeping political coalitions together? Is it about the media? Is it about the industry? Is it about machinery of government? Again, to what Richard said. What is the? How should we think about the political obstacles? Can I start with Jo?
So yeah, yes to it's about the political obstacle of a wing of the party and government believing that this is nanny statism, and that's why I suggested that we need to reframe the argument to make it more palatable for those people that see this as a kind of an imposition of the state on the individual, because the same individuals, you know, if they are asked if they think that we should do something about diabetes levels going through the roof or obesity in children, will inevitably say, well, that's, you know, that's wrong, government should do something about that, or, and, you know, what can we do? So we have to highlight the inconsistency of thinking that says, well, you know, people should be able to eat what they like, but the consequences then we have to treat in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, we can't afford this level of obesity in the UK. We do not have the public services and the economic backdrop to cope. And I completely agree with Kate's point on you can't just fix this through the lens of food. So food is really, really important. But if you don't tackle this through a whole range of other sort of levers and departments, you won't make the level of progress that you want. So that's been part of the real challenge. I mean, both political parties are going through something of a kind of focus on how to get economic growth into the country, and I think that is the number one issue in UK politics. And I think if you want to get anything on any political agenda, you have to go through the economic frame, and you have to look at what the costs are and what the benefits would be if you introduce much more different types of policies. So for trying to make change, and it's quite good because you sort of pivot onto the turf, which is often the people who are pushing nanny states who actually have got an economic agenda which you can actually probably align behind. And when you talk about the wider costs of obesity, the economic costs, NHS costs, personal costs, that starts to actually really resonate that we just, as a country, can't afford this, and we need to do something quite radically different in order to tackle it. I think on the point on smoking, I think that's also one of the big challenges, because what you find is you say, well, people don't need to smoke, but people do need to eat, and then you get into a whole conversation about personal choice and personal responsibility, and basically people feel like you're taking away something that they should be able to choose, which is why when you read something like Henry Dimbleby's book and about the cycle and about the environment, it's trying to have a conversation which is has a bit of a wider lens to it, is I think also really, really important. I think people feel like they have a choice, and actually they don't. And that's a really, really difficult message to land with people. And some of that you need to tackle through education and information. We've gone away in this country from doing lots of public health campaigns. There was lots done in the early 2000s on what was about healthy lives, healthy choices, wasn't it, or something like, I can't try to remember the exact phrase, but there was loads done on 5 a day and everything, and they really did resonate with people. But because it's been difficult, we've sort of walked away from some of that. And I do wonder whether we need to get back to some basic public health educational campaigns, which actually would be quite cheap to run, but could actually be quite impactful for people, particularly during a cost of living crisis and everything else. So yeah, just a few reflections from me on that specific conundrum around, you know, political will to do stuff.
So I'll come at this from an evidence point of view. People broadly agree this is a big problem and we need to solve it. You know, you ask anyone, they don't say the health of the nation's fine, don't worry about it. And so the problem comes from what do you do about it? And the arguments that get put of there's no silver bullet, of course, and that gets people like, oh, well, is it too hard to do anything? Or do people say, oh, well, you know, we need education, we need information, we need physical activity? Those tend to be the three things that people will say if you just ask them in the street, what do you need to do to sort out obesity? Those are the three things that would have the least impact from the evidence. So there's this real problem because people genuinely want to help. And so then they're suggesting something that they genuinely think will work, but the evidence suggests that is not true. And so that's the gutting thing here. The effort that is being putting in is being misdirected. And you could, you know, use the same amount of effort or political capital and have much, much better results if you just followed the kind of broadening and ever growing amount of scientific evidence in the space. And that's in line with making it easier for people as well. You know, you're not sort of saying, here's another thing of information. Hope you read this every day along with what your bank statement is and keeping up with the news and educating your kids. You know, it's how can we get the policy impetus that there is, you know, ride on the energy, but push it towards things that would make a difference. And the core bit about this no silver bullet is people historically have not quantified the change that would be required. So then it becomes very difficult. So you say, there's a problem. I'm going to put something on the table. You know, we're increasing weight management services or something like that. Good, you know, box ticked. But it's not proportionate to the challenge. And so that's where sort of the green agenda has been much more successful recently by saying this is the absolute amount of change we need to see in carbon or something like that. We need something similar in this space so we can see whether, you know, policy A, B, C, D, and E add up to something that gives us a decent shot at making this. Because at the moment, the will that there is there has been sort of squandered on things that are very low impact, and people don't know if it's likely to have the impact they hope it would. So I think hopefully we can make some improvements on that. We're actually producing something be out next year around sort of what we think a blueprint would look like for halving obesity. You know, if you did all this stuff and it roughly went how you'd expect it to, what do you think would be commensurate to the challenge? And we're hoping that will move the debate on from sort of piecemeal interventions around information provision or education.
Can I just come back on that? Because I think it's a really good point on, and this comes back to the design problem in policy, is what we end up doing is we end up over-relying on one or two levers, which then don't add up to anything of substance, and the rates continue to tick up. So if you ran a decent education campaign and then you had alongside that a whole series of other measures, that might actually be part of a package that would actually work. But I think we're talking about you've got to add policy together in a way which creates a coherent framework. You can't just sort of say, well, we're going to try this or we're going to try that and we're going to do a bit of this and a bit of that. It's you've got to kind of knit it together in a much more coherent way. And I think business would welcome that because they'd sort of see the direction and the ambition that was coming through. But it can't just be relying on one sort of policy lever. We need multiple interventions in order to make the progress we want to see here.
I mean, you know, following on from that point from Richard, I mean, it's back to the point about it is a really complex social problem. I mean, I was talking to one of our companies the other day that runs, that supports charities in East London on helping people to eat better. And it was supporting a kitchen where people would go and learn to make a healthy meal out of relatively simple ingredients. And some of the comment from the people who were there was that, well, I can make this in your kitchen, but I don't have a sharp knife at home. I'm not going to cut an onion, or I don't have a hob. Can I heat it in a microwave? So it just, I use that just an example of how complex this is. So there are some bits of it that need quite a lot more intervention than others. So some of it, I think, would be touched by a different sort of health campaign, public health campaign. And, you know, one of the things that we encounter on that is, I mean, you may be surprised to know, I think I was quite surprised to know when I joined the industry that when all this reformulation goes on, a lot of it is never explicit to consumers. Because if we put on a packet, here is a healthy version of this thing, people don't buy it. And that's particularly true of cakes and confectionery and that sort of thing. By the time people, you know, if you go into a shop to buy a bar of chocolate because you've had a miserable afternoon, you're going to drink it, you're going to eat it while you drink a cup of tea. Actually, you've got to the stage where you think, no, I need that nice, comforting thing. I want the indulgence. And so the healthier products then often don't succeed, and therefore, obviously if companies can't sell them, they won't continue to make them. Very often the more successful reformulated products are the ones where companies never say, and that's been very true of breakfast cereal, for instance. Massive efforts over the last few years to take salt and sugar out of breakfast cereals. And for those of you that grew up with certain brands of breakfast cereal, go and buy the brands now and taste them, and I can assure you they will taste quite different to how you had them as children. But generally, the industry hasn't told consumers about that, because that's not what, consumers are then suspicious, and they think, well, no, I love that brand of cereal, I'm not going to buy it anymore. So, but I think it would be really helpful for us if also there was other nudging that said, actually, the healthy stuff is good. And if you eat a balance of the healthy and the less healthy stuff in a week, actually, you would be making progress. And actually, at that point, you would feel better. That would contribute both to your physical health and to your mental well-being. So I think there is definitely a case for that. I think it doesn't then hit all areas and all demographics in society, and that's where the range of interventions come in. I mean, the other one that we are very conscious of, because we work a lot with breakfast clubs and schools one way or the other, not necessarily, sometimes it's financial donations, sometimes it's in kind, it depends the sort of products that the company is making. But actually, there is, I do think there's a case for doing more in schools. Very often the industry raises that, and the pushback we get is, well, you would say that you're pushing the responsibility onto somebody else. But I mean, we've done a bunch of consumer research around this recently, and basically what parents seem to be saying is, I can't persuade my children to eat well at home if they're not getting those messages at school, and I don't want to buy things. I have a tight budget. I do not want to buy things that my children aren't going to eat. So I'm not going to buy cauliflower, they won't eat it, and then it rots in my fridge. So I do think there is something more that could be done around schools. I mean, some schools are doing brilliant work on this, and I know how tight school budgets are and how limited teacher time is. But I sort of feel that central government might be able to do more, because I think it's very much left to the schools and the local authorities at the moment. And why you would have your the things you need to do to use in a chemistry experiment at school. I don't see why the school will buy those, but then if kids are doing a cooking class at school, they're asked to bring the ingredients in. That doesn't seem to be right. There seems to be something a bit wrong in the priorities there. So yes, a range of different things in that space, but I really do think there's space for more public health information. It's very interesting, if you compare other European countries, we are one of the only ones that doesn't have a consistent baseline public health campaign running.
Yeah, so bring it back to your question around kind of the barriers from the government side. I mean, from my perspective, we've talked about it already, but it's a systemic issue. It's a wicked problem, and it needs a systemic solution. It was mentioned in a panel earlier, but I think the Amsterdam example of the work they did on childhood obesity is really interesting, where they looked at kind of marketing and advertising restrictions at the same time as intervention in schools, at the same time as education. And I think that's a good example of that. I think the economic argument, when I hear that, I think it's really good that we're talking about that, because I think the economic case has come on a lot in the last, especially in the last 3-4 years since I've been working in this space. It was a group of kind of niche investors, only 4 years ago, kind of getting together on this topic. And we're now at a stage where over 30 are part of an investor coalition trying to influence the government on this issue. And it's also another kind of shareholder way that we can exert shareholder pressure is via shareholder resolutions that we file at a company's annual general meeting. And for the first time, a couple of years ago, there was one filed at a UK retailer, and that has then led to several more at large retailers and manufacturers. So there are real signals that economic case is working its way through. And I think whenever you have a systemic issue like this, you need this kind of all stakeholders around a table to be part of the problem. And I think we're there, which is really exciting. And I think we have a lot to learn. Hugo mentioned the work on kind of nature and the green agenda. We don't have the time that we've had to sort of get climate change on the agenda, but that is a really good example of where we articulated the risk and opportunity that was facing companies and investors. We had the right supporting regulation, mandatory disclosure around climate risk. and other supporting work, and we are making kind of progress there. It's not perfect, but it's a good example of how work on a particular sustainability issue can kind of move forward. And the last thing I mentioned, I heard this on a panel as well earlier, but I do think it's really important to have this kind of task force across government working on this, just to kind of connect the dots. And sorry, one final point, which is around kind of political leadership. I think it's notoriously been an issue which kind of, especially sort of senior politicians, have been very nervous to kind of be the sort of figurehead for, but we absolutely need that. We need someone making the long-term case for this. But it's equally brilliant to hear you, Joe, being so supportive of this, but please, can we get it out there even more?
Well, I mean, I could ask this panel questions all evening, but I won't subject you to that. And I'm sure you've got better ones than me anyway. So I'll throw it open to you and take maybe 2 or 3 questions. Yes, lady in the front here.
Jen Elford, Head of Policy at the Vegetarian Society. Do we need education on healthy eating, or do we actually need people to have new food experiences? For health and also for climate, obviously. One of the things the Vegetarian Society is working on is giving people the opportunity to choose more healthy, plant-based and delicious options through public sector catering in schools and hospitals and large workplaces. 60% of people are obese and 60% of people are willing to eat less meat. What do the panel make of the idea of public sector catering expanding plant-based?
There's a gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Tom Mercer. I've run a food business for the last 18 years. I would really support what Joe says, and I think public awareness is really key, and I don't think there's been much of it. I'd also support regulation, actually. But what I don't see at the moment is a clear, joined up goals of what we actually want to do. What is causing obesity? Is it fat? Is it sugar? Is it preservatives? What are the key goals that you're trying to communicate? And I do think it's really important to work with industry on that and have them involved in the conversation. So we're coming up with the right messages that then get put out into the public awareness and also into the regulation.
And there at the back.
Thanks very much. My name is Patty Rundle. I'm from an organisation that's been protecting child health for about 40 years, a long time. But we work a lot with big corporations, particularly in Codex and in an international thing. And I really am scared when I hear the industry wanting to come in on education, something that really is not their place. And we've seen it so often, industry just coming in and not doing the right thing, and just there's a huge image transfer if they just reduce this or take out trans fats or whatever. It's so easy for them to just hoodwink everybody, undermine the confidence in family foods, in our issue, breastfeeding or real food. It is so easy. And I deal with them at Codex, where trading standards are met. So please, can we be really careful when we start talking about actually involving the food industry? It was great that somebody called Hugo, I missed a bit, was saying keep policy setting free. Well, you didn't actually say that, you said the goals, but these are messy areas here about when you bring the food industries, what is it you want them to do? Do you want them to give them more information? Because they will never tell you unless you do some deal with them. They just won't. I mean, WHO and everything tried forever to get industry to do it. And then one thing somebody said about plant-based, vegetarian, at Codex this comes up, the plant-based foods are mostly ultra-processed. They're as million miles away from plants as you can imagine. So can we just get back to real food, real vegetables, real things, and you know, encourage people? We need school. There used to be in Sustain, I was 20 years as the thing of Sustain. We had teaching in schools, skills for cooking, you know, and those are gone. Not just about learning about how to make a pizza or whatever. It's actually hands-on learning how to do it and actually doing it. Thanks.
Great. I'll let Karen come in first on the education point and what industry's doing.
Sorry, I mean, I think you must have misunderstood me. We don't want to set the curriculum for food education in schools. My point was we need education in schools, and I think just as you've said, we need more cooking skills in schools, and we need something that helps people to understand what the food groups are and what a balanced diet would be. But no, we're not seeking to set that, and indeed, that's pretty much set out in the Eat Well plate and in the government guidance now. It's just it's not routinely, systematically, consistently taught. And my point was, if we think chemistry is important, which we do, I'm not seeking to make diminish that in any way, but cooking is important too, and schools ought to be supported with providing the baseline components to those lessons. Shall I quickly respond on a couple of the other points as well? Working with industry on goals is really important, because sometimes, we have had the experience of, and I can't remember exactly which policy it was at which point, but we were asked to reduce, I don't know, it was either a percentage of salt or a percentage of sugar. Was it 20% of sugar or salt by 2020? Sugar by 2020. And of course, you just can't do that in all products. So I think it needs to be the goals need to be nuanced. If you take 20% of the sugar out of cake, you may not have a cake. You certainly don't out of chocolate. So yes, the goals need to be kind of workable and realistic, and take into account, I think, again, that people will want a balance of choice. Whilst we want to provide more healthy products, we have to accept that people also want indulgent products every now and again, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as it is every now and again. And on the point about vegetarianism and sustainable food, I mean, I would bring affordable into that as well. I think there is a move to look at much more clearly where the ingredients are coming from, and to make them sustainable. We have some public sector caterers in our membership, but not as many as I think as other bodies. And I think that is very much on their minds. I think that because of the low costs associated with public sector contracts, many companies are pushed into that space anyway. Affordability being a big issue there. And I suppose the other thing I would say on some of those, one issue that springs to mind, it spans both products and farming. So if you look at chicken, for instance, one of the reasons apparently for the proliferation of chicken shops, which is not necessarily helping the health of teenagers, is the way in which we eat chicken, the way in which we buy it in supermarkets, which is generally already broken up, and generally people eat more breast meat than leg, and the leg meat goes to the chicken shops. So there are other sort of food system things that I think we should look at in that space.
Yeah, I mean, chicken is a whole, I don't know if we want to open the chicken box. There's a lot to say in there. Hugo, you have solved nutritional epidemiology because.
Well, no, there was a point about getting out. What do you actually mean by healthy? What are you setting as a sort of standard target? So there's, I'm sure you're familiar with it. There's something called the nutrient profiling model, and it's a way you can score food on sort of a health scale. And you get minus points for high sugar, high salt, high fat. You get plus points for high protein, high fruit and veg content, high fiber. And so that exists. And so part of the something we should absolutely be pushing for in the Food Data Transparency Partnership is mandatory reporting of the sales of products and including that nutritional information. And then you can kind of cut it a bunch of different ways. You want to use the nutrient profiling model. You want to use France's Nutri-Score model. There's a couple of different versions of it. But if you have that core component of the macronutrient makeup of the food, then you can do that. And so we already have this. It's already used in legislation. So that's one of the reasons when we're talking about these targets, we're setting them on this scale. So this sort of already exists. If you're an HFSS food, it means you have a suitably high score that you're not allowed to be positioned now in certain areas of the supermarket. And so to try to make it easy for industry, can we keep it on the same scale? So, if this is already data they're collecting, because they need to know where they can put something in the shop, you're not asking them to collect different kind of data or sort of, some other way. So the good information does exist on this. We have it already in regulations. And so whilst there might be new scientific advances that it's genuinely good to have an academic debate about, let's not let that be the enemy of progress in terms of a system where we've got something that works pretty well and we just need to actually start using it.
Can I just push that point a little bit to say, how do we say robust to the changing science? Because I don't think we should be nihilistic about nutritional epidemiology, but it is hard fundamentally for scientific reasons. I think the broad outlines are likely to stay the same, but in 10 or 15 years, we probably will have a slightly different understanding of what is healthy and what is not. How can we build that flexibility into our policy without changing on the latest fad or being driven by one paper here or there?
So it's a great question. And the update to the nutrient profiling model is, I think, 5 years overdue, something like that. Looking at Dolly. And so there are these processes, but it's not being implemented by government. So there are these scientific groups, SACN, and they do these reviews and they say, you know, how have these things changed? And you're absolutely right. They tend to not change wholesale. It's actually, this thing's a little worse than we thought it was, or this thing's a little better. And we are just so far off even the basics. You know, you can agree on, people even, you know, you have a lay understanding of food that is healthy or unhealthy, right? You can look at stuff, and we're still so far away from even incentivizing that sort of change that I think people can get dialed down and like, oh, but does this vitamin balance out this amount of, you know, animal protein in it? It's like, let's have that argument when it's relevant to have that argument. Let's make the basic progress first.
I would say it's quite confusing though, from an industry's point of view, certainly from the public's point of view. Sorry to butt in. I'd say it's quite confusing from an industry point of view and from a public point of view on the nutritional profiling. And you know, I've been involved in the industry for ages, and HFSS was clear but really complicated to calculate. So my point is, I don't think it is that clear at all, actually. Generally, for the industry, these scores and measures, I think, are tricky for the industry, and I don't think they're particularly known by the public.
And I mean, I should probably add that I think the consistency point that you've made, but I think you've slightly undermined, but Sophie absolutely made, you know, industry can do all of these things. We can measure all sorts of things. We can measure what regulation and government asks us to measure in our food, but it is a scientific process. It takes quite a lot of time. That is really, really difficult for smaller businesses, by the way. So the consistency, I think, is more important. I think that was the point that you were making, that we could make, you know, we need to make the general steps before getting too involved in all of the detail. But it is that consistency. Companies do invest an enormous amount in making sure that their nutritional information is accurate against the MPN, and the longer things can stay in place, the better. So obviously they have to change if for some reason they are wrong or the nutritional guidance changes. But in general, it's better if they stay consistent for a period of time, because that in the end actually makes us all the more confident that the information being communicated to consumers is accurate. And the other point I would make on small and medium-sized enterprises in this area is it's quite a scientific investment to get all of this information. The Scottish Government runs a really great programme called Reformulation for Health, where they spent about £100,000 a year over the last 4 or 5 years, so we're nearly at £500,000, where they support smaller businesses to be able to get that scientific research, that scientific support and advice in order to help them reformulate products, and also to be really clear about what the ingredient profiles are in those products. And given that, you know, 97% of our sector is SMEs, it would be really helpful, I think, if government innovation funds didn't always look at slightly more, you know, sexy scientific areas, but that actually supported the food and drink industry in making sure that we can put all the right R&D into this part of what we do.
Can I just add something on there? So I think just coming back to the mandatory reporting, that's why we are so, you know, supportive of mandatory reporting, because you know, when we talked to the retailers, and that the work that came out of the Investor Coalition was actually after us having a lot of engagement with retailers, manufacturers in our investment portfolios, and then telling us, you know, we're overwhelmed by the different sustainability standards, whether it's on health or nature or climate, and actually we don't know which one is the best one to put our kind of name to. And I really sort of empathize with that burden. There's also, it's come at the same time as a huge amount of kind of regulation, both to your investors but also your consumers and so on, which is largely positive. But it is really helpful if we can get together and say, this is the metric or the 2 or 3 metrics that we are going to collectively agree on. And they're not going to be perfect, but they will get us hopefully a bit further along. You know, if we look at we were talking about the Eat Well guidelines, only 0.1% of the UK population is actually following the Eat Well guidelines. So we've got a huge amount that we can still try and progress. I just wanted to also just pick up on the vegetarian point, which was to say, you know, one of the reasons when we started this coalition, we didn't just focus on health, was we want to see a healthy, sustainable and affordable food system. And that's really challenging, right? You're weighing up a lot of competing priorities. But I think it's important that we talk about those and we actually think about where are the kind of overlaps. We're not going to be able to get kind of affordable within planetary boundaries, within food security, within healthy, within supply chain resilience, all at the same time. But let's think about this as a systems problem and not just tackle any one of those issues in isolation.
Yeah, I'm just a little bit worried the direction the conversation's going, that it's becoming very sort of technocratic and very, you know, if we add another 3 things to the labelling, that will be able to tell people how simple it is to make the right choices. It's already far too complicated. The labelling for the normal average consumer, you know, how many of us would go into a supermarket and read, you know, the 17 different things on a label and go, well, yeah, that's going to be my choice for tonight. And I think that the people that we need to reach most and the communities we need to reach most probably definitely wouldn't have the time to do that. So, you know, if there's a public health message, it's got to be, you know, eat fresh, eat, you know, fruit and veg and you know, meat in moderation and you know, try and have a better mix. So, I mean, yes, we need to work on reformulations. Yes, we need to do all those things. But if we're going to take the public with us, we have to simplify the argument. Because if we don't do that, we just, you know, it's going to be another of the 687 policy ideas that didn't go anywhere. I think the other thing we haven't even mentioned is the fact of why people eat food. You know, it may sound obvious, but we don't just eat food to survive. A lot of people eat food for comfort. And, you know, when we're talking about prevention, the role of mental health support services, volunteering, you know, let's take you know, if we're looking at cross-departmental support, we need to take this debate much wider than just, well, if you change your burger for a green salad, then, you know, we've solved the obesity problem. Because people will eat things for different reasons. And unless we look into a much more fundamental relationship that we have with food, we're not going to solve the problem.
Yeah, I would completely concur with that. There's a reason why the nutrient profile model hasn't been updated since I was in government, actually. And it was amazing when Hugo mentioned it. I was like, oh yeah, I remember looking at that. And the reason is because if you start from there, you've lost. Because what you get into is a row about, is yogurt more unhealthy than something else? And basically you've completely lost the public at that point. You will have to do the update, but you need to do it in an environment in which you can land the message that you want to land, which is the sensible message. So I get why you want to make the changes and the evidence updates and everything else, but the public isn't in that space. The public is working out how to afford food, how to cook it if they can cook it. We need to be thinking not necessarily starting from that position. We've got, and this comes back to education and comms and all those other sorts of things that I was talking about. And you can't just fix this through the lens of food. So yeah, I completely concur with Joe on the kind of political pop narrative that you need to bring people with you.
Can I just very briefly come back on that? Just to say that I think with some of the data, we're talking about the rules and incentives that are changing the food system and the companies and then, you know, the allocators of capital in those companies. I'm not advocating for all of that data then be used for consumers. And I think there's two different things that we're talking about there. But I absolutely think it wouldn't be right to overwhelm consumers' information, but it is important if we're thinking about how do we change the food environment and the rules and incentives that are creating that food environment. Data plays a role beyond just what consumers see.
Thanks so much. Dolly Van Teliken, have been working in the space for many years. I have a question about, in terms of recent policies that have been in the almost 700 to have not necessarily led to any improvements. We've had the Food and Data Transparency Partnership, which on the health metrics have been watered down to voluntary measures. We've had the 2-year delay to the marketing policies, which for anyone who doesn't know is a 9 p.m. watershed on junk food advertising on TV and online, and the promotions of buy one, get one free, so price promotions in supermarkets, have been delayed another 2 years to 2025. Those are 3 of a massive number of policies that have been delayed, scrapped, or watered down over the past few years. So I wanted to ask the panel, in terms of their experience of industry lobbying. In the years that I've worked in this, the Food and Drinks Federation has come up time and time again as one of the biggest lobbyists against certain policies. So I would love to hear the opinion of the experience of people around industry lobbying and what can be done to make sure that, exactly going back to the point of the role that industry can play, to not be blocking the progression of policy, and maybe the opinion of Karen on those particular policies of, are you supportive of them, and if we can hear that, and if not, then why?
Any other questions? Or, I mean, that's a good one. Okay, let's do. Karen, do you want to have first bash at the role of lobbying? What the appropriate? Well, firstly, do you get everything that you want? And what's the kind of appropriate role of influencing lobbying participation in the debate of the industry, and anybody else as well, other stakeholders too?
So I think that, you know, the industry does obviously talk to government a lot about proposed regulation, and some of that is formal consultation, some of it is conversations. What we really want is for policies that government pass to work, and we want them to be realistic in terms of what we can do and where we think consumers are at, because we know a fair amount about consumers because we sell products to them. So we're not trying to be obstructive. We are trying to make sure that when government passes regulation, that it's going to be successful regulation. And I think, you know, I mean, I'm not going to rehearse the arguments on HFSS and advertising. Those, you know, those regulations have been passed, and you know, we didn't have a big role in when they are now being implemented. But I think we were concerned at the time that the evidence base wasn't very strong. At the end of the day, if we're going to pass regulation, we need to be fairly sure that it's going to have some sort of impact. And if it's not possible to have that evidence when the regulation is passed, to make sure that the regulation contains provisions that sets out how evidence will be gathered and then assessed as the regulation develops. Because, you know, there are impacts. There are definitely economic impacts on the industry of that regulation. Now, as I say, you know, we absolutely want positive progress on obesity, poor diets and health. So, so what we just want to make sure is that those economic negative impacts don't outweigh the positive impacts of the regulations. So that's, you know, that's really the role we play. You know, we get branded as lobbyists, and I think it is representing genuine views around, you know, around the table. And I would hope from the conversation that we've just had right now that many people in the room, perhaps not everybody, accepts that industry does have a valid voice in all of this. And I think government is very good at balancing the different views that come into it. You know, we don't have privileged access to any degree, but they do take our views into account. They do listen to them, and I think that's right. But then they take a decision on policy, and it doesn't always come out where we would have had it. But, you know, that's the process. That's what good government does. in terms of consulting on regulation and then making decisions. So, but yes, I mean, my overall general point would be we want to work with partners on progressing this one. It's not in our interests either. You know, the economic impacts that we've been talking about are as real for us as they are for anyone else, and that's one of the reasons why, as I said earlier, we're running some pilot programs in the industry at the moment on workplace health, because we know that as employers we have quite a lot of influence on the health of the people who work for us, and that's really important. We have roles across our industry. Some of them are quite physical, quite active roles, some of them less so, but we need healthy, healthy employees to be able to do those sorts of jobs, and those sorts of programs look at, you know, exercise and those sorts of things, what's available to our employees, but it also looks at what are the healthy options that are offered to people in canteens. Are they taking those when they're offered? And we're also looking at shifts and you know, the impact that the dietary and health impacts that often affect shift workers, because we, you know, most of our sites run on shifts. So yeah, we try to be as constructive as possible.
Richard, Joe, presumably you've been lobbied a fair bit in your time. How big an obstacle to change is it?
I think they haven't bothered trying to lobby me because they know I'm with Dolly. So, I mean, the interesting thing about the buy one, get one free suspension or abolition or whatever we did with it was that it was linked specifically to the cost of living crisis. Now, evidence was quite clear that the incentivizing people to buy twice as much junk food, and because the offers were always on, you know, I've never seen a buy one broccoli, get one broccoli stem for free. So it was incentivizing people who, you know, had very tight budgets to buy more junk food, and they would spend, I think it was 20% more than they could afford because they saw an offer. So this impulse buying was actually not helping the most vulnerable being able to pay their food bills. But the political argument was, we can't, at a time when people are feeling the pinch, say to them, we're going to stop you having bargains. And that was how it was framed. So it was very difficult. And, you know, I can understand why it was challenging for government. There's never going to be a great time, is there, to change people's behavioural patterns, because there will always be people who will say, well, you know, I need help, I need support. And I guess the food industry will always have the special offers on the junk food end of the market. So we really have to just shift the narrative on this.
Yeah, I think that the danger as you run into the next election is both parties chase a pro-business vote that then leads to the overplay of the costs to industry rather than the costs to society. And as I said earlier, we can talk about partnership, we can talk about working together, and talk about the implementation plan and what's a realistic target. But there has to be, in this relationship, a degree of tension for it to be working. And if there is no tension, it's not working. And yeah, the danger is both political parties want economic growth. They hear the economic arguments in the industry about what regulation might cost and etc. And it's not just food, the food industry, the advertising industry, and the broadcasting industry is also there making very, very strong arguments. They make a lot of money out of this. And what you need to do is you need to look at the equation here. And as I said at the top of my remarks, we cannot afford as a society this level of obesity. So how do we tackle that? And what is a sensible set of interventions across a whole range of areas to actually start to bring these rates down quite significantly? The other thing I'd add is I worry over the last 10, 15 years that because the way we found our way in to talk about obesity is childhood obesity, that basically we're starting to see this as just a childhood problem, and it's not. This is a whole societal problem. And because politicians have kind of been nervous about going and talking to adults about what they should eat and what they shouldn't eat, we've basically ended up focusing on children, because people can agree that children shouldn't be obese, and we can all rally around that, and parenthood, and there's loads of messages. There's lots of good messages for politicians on that. But this is a much wider societal challenge that we have. And we need to not only be thinking about childhood obesity, but we need serious action to tackle adult rates of obesity and obesity rates in older populations as well. So this is not just a childhood health issue, albeit that is really important. And the other thing, just coming back to the question, is, again, it comes back to the design problem, which is what we do is we put a policy up in headlights, we have a big political discussion, which falls down, and basically it sort of says, well, is the evidence there? It's only going to save X, and this is why you need a full framework to start and say, look, these are all interconnected things that if you do them together will start to deliver the change that you really, really want to see. There's no Hail Mary here, there's no silver bullet. It's got to be a whole change to how you set up policy. And I think if we could get there, and I don't think politicians are going to tackle this agenda this side of the election. I just think high behind the cost of living and everything else. On the other side of the election, whoever's the next government is going to have to take this a lot more seriously. And I think it's holding them accountable for what they might do on that, which is going to be really, really important.
Hugo, you gave us a nice idea at the start. Is it going to get lobbied to death?
Hopefully not. But I think one of my experiences of these things is very different evidence thresholds that you hold people to. So when we work in health, people tend to think about drugs and stuff, and you can get very high quality evidence with drugs because it's easy to give someone the real drug or a placebo drug, and you do the randomized control trial and you see if it works. That type of evaluation isn't feasible for these sorts of system level changes. And so then you have people saying, oh, well, the evidence isn't good enough. A standard that would not be applied to any other policy area. It just happens to be that we're adjacent to pharma medicine trials. And so that's what people think is reasonable, and it's just not. And so, yeah, I welcome Karen's comments on, set up evaluation of these things. Absolutely. But to do that, you need the mandatory data reporting. So it's all linked in. And if you have that mandatory data reporting, you can then see if the impacts are being realized, and you can see what change would be required in terms of the food that people are purchasing, or rather the food that's being sold to them, is probably the way I'd frame it, to cause a halving of obesity or reduction in diabetes or whatever we need to be able to afford this. And then you can hopefully put it all together. So I think it's not holding ourselves to too high a standard of evidence that's kind of holding this policy area back because it's so close to medicine. And I think if we just gave ourselves a little bit of slack and said, let's try it and we'll see if it works, but with a plan that we think is actually proportional to see real impact in the real world, we could actually make real progress here. And so I think we should end on sort of an optimistic note that it feels really hard, but the actual change needed is not that big. We just need to go thinking about it a bit of a different way.
Yeah, I think this is a super important area, and it's definitely something we're thinking about as investors. I think one of the benefits of this rising up the investor agenda is investors are demanding a lot more transparency from companies about the lobbying that they're doing. And actually, we can look to climate again. There's something called the Responsible Climate Lobbying Standard, and there's already discussions underway about the work that could look to do the same for health. And I know that the Access to Nutrition Initiative, who provide really good research and kind of benchmarking this area, are looking at this as an area of priority. So I think it's, the role that investors can play is demanding more transparency around what kind of membership organizations are you part of, what is the alignment between your own health and nutrition strategy and those memberships and organizations, and if there is an inconsistency, how are you kind of justifying that and putting that same level of scrutiny that we have for other issues. So I think that's a small role that we can play.
Great. So we're into the last 5 minutes. So I'm just going to ask people to sum up with a final question, which is we've heard about a range of ideas, a range of initiatives. There's a lot of energy around this issue, and yet things got a whole lot worse in the 1990s, and they haven't got better since. We're much worse than we were 30 years ago. We haven't made much progress in certainly the last decade, 15 years. Do you feel optimistic or pessimistic, and what is driving that fundamentally? Let's start with Richard.
So short-term pessimistic. Short-term pessimistic, but I also like to try and be optimistic. And I think this is a challenge which increasingly people are sort of turning to, as indeed panelists have been saying, and saying, look, how do we look at this problem slightly differently? Something's not working here. And by looking at it differently, we might be able to make progress and change in a different way. And I think even in that process, we can be optimistic. And I really welcome Hugo's paper as part of the pre-read on, you know, can we have a look at a different way of doing things? I mean, it's all really helpful to start to think about it, but we can't also just go for one thing. It's got to be that's my ongoing point. You've got to do a consistent range of the different policy levers to make real progress.
Pessimistic in the short term because of where we are in the electoral cycle. But I think there's a real opportunity to be lobbying government and opposition to have something in their manifestos that is a commitment in the longer term, not just to writing another policy that won't get implemented, but actually in more detail what they're going to actively do to shift the dial in the next 5 years.
I'll go optimistic. I mean, I'm from an innovation charity, right? If I'm not optimistic, who is? But the reason is the change that is required in people's diets is just not that big. The change that is required in business practice is just not that big. It's just hard. It's hard to think about it all the time on a day-to-day basis. And actually the advent of big data and the sort of reporting and, you know, it's no longer somebody checking off each item that was sold in their store today. They sort of get these big data repositories. We should be optimistic about the opportunities that gives us to set regulation that can meaningfully have an impact on this. And so I think we should be optimistic about this. And I think we should be optimistic about it without accepting a joyless food model. So, you know, what our modeling suggests is you can have these changes without saying, like, you're never allowed cake ever again in your life. You know, these small changes, it's many, many, many very small, almost imperceivable changes to the environment. And that's what's got us hit to the problem. We want to sort of reverse the changes to go back to the similar food environment towards the 1990s. And that should work. And so that's why I'm optimistic about it.
Well, I'm optimistic too. As oh gosh, I've forgotten your name now. Hugo has said, you really actually need relatively small changes to most people's lives to get us into a much better place. I mean, I think it's something like 10% change. It's not enormous at all. So they are relatively small changes on everybody's parts. Obviously, that has been hard, but I am very much of the view that we need a range of different interventions. Some of those will be relatively cheap to implement. Some of them are going to be more expensive, but if it's the health of our nation at stake, then we ought to be prepared to consider them. But yes, no one solution will do it. We need a range of interventions and we need to be able to measure those, and we need to be able to understand which of those are effective and that we continue with, and which of those are not effective and we stop them and we move on.
Yeah, I don't know which one to go with, but I think on a day-to-day basis, I think it is quite a pessimistic outlook. I mean, I think it comes back to it's really tough when you're trying to design a policy environment to tackle these long-term systemic issues. We just had it mentioned around the short-term electoral cycle, and I think that is a really big barrier. And we need to collectively, as a society, as an economy, as collective humans, we need to be able to overcome that, whether we're talking about health or climate or nature, because these systemic issues are going to come and bite us if we don't. And we all know that that's kind of there. So we need to be thinking about how do we put that into the short term. And then I guess more positive note is being on this panel, and actually we're all coming at this from very different perspectives, but there's a lot of commonality in what we're saying. And I think we all recognize that there is a problem to be tackled. So that's where the kind of optimism comes from, if we can all try and tackle it together.
Fantastic. That's a great note to end on. So thanks everyone for coming along today. Thanks to the panel for your thoughts and insights and ideas. Thanks to everyone at Nesta and Social Market Foundation for putting this together. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your conference.